Merci.
Thank you.
Ce long CV signifie simplement que je suis
I'm
vieux.
old.
Je suis
I'm
Canadien,
Canadian,
mais de
but from
l'Ontario.
Ontario.
Avec votre
So
permission, je vais
I'm going
continuer
to
en
give
anglais.
my talk in English.
Merci.
Thank you.
No, pas de place. I come to speak to you about the coming marriage of computers and cars and the remarkable changes that's going to mean for our world. We've been learning all day about technology changing and things moving faster and faster. Well, cars are such a big part of our cities and lives that when they become digital, the change is transformative. I'm going to look at several different pillars of change, the most important of which, though, is saving lives. But I'm also going to look at industries like the energy industry, how cities work, how we live in them, and in fact, a dozen other industries that are going to see major change because of this. But let's begin with saving lives, which we can do, as Pierre said, because we're not very good drivers, right? Around the world, every year, we kill 1.2 million people. That is like one of the world's great diseases. We have become blind to it. Now, in the United States, the number is around 34,000 people. Every year, it actually went up last year. And the American Highway Safety Board calculated a cost of that of $871 billion US. Now that works out to about 29 American cents a mile or 16 euro cents a kilometer, which is more than the cost of the essence, the gasoline, in a Hummer. More for your share of accidents than for the fuel. Now, Americans also spend, by my calculation, 50 billion hours doing this. I'm not going to do it for 50 billion more hours. But to put that in context, the entire labor output of the United States is only 240 billion hours. A significant fraction of that, manipulating steering wheels. Now, here in France, the number is better, a little over 3,000 dead from car accidents a couple of years ago here in France, and that's half the rate per person of the United States, but it's just underneath it per kilometer. Most Northern European countries do a little bit better than the Americans. If you want to get killed, the most dangerous city in Europe, well, you probably know where it is. Now, 40% of those accidents involve alcohol, and so robots very rarely drink, which is something pretty nice about them. This Mexican robot is famous for being an exception. We can do something there, and we've given our cities over to cars in ways we've become blind to. More than half the land in some cities is driveways and parking lots and garages and roads. 25% of the energy of Western countries is going to transportation, 25% of the greenhouse gas emissions, and the whole human race, by my calculation, drives every year 1.7 light years. How many of you use light years in your work? That's a unit of human activity, which is astonishing to me. So, this is not something from science fiction. Now, this began with a government contest, but since then, everybody's gotten in the game. And in fact, the company that's announced the first date for deploying vehicles to customers is actually Volvo, which you may think is a Swedish car company. It's now Chinese. But Volvo is going to have 100 customers in cars driving around the ring road around Göteborg in Sweden, where their headquarters is, next year in 2017. Shortly after that, 100 more in London and 100 more in a Chinese city and then in the United States. Now, all the car companies are getting in. I will actually rank first among them Daimler. And why I say that is not just because of the research that they've done and the good lab that they have, but because they've shown a willingness to think in a way different than what you would think a car company over 100 years old would think. Here, for example, on the corner of the screen, you can in fact see one of their concept cars with the seats facing each other. But more than that, they have a service that they run in many German cities called Car2Go. Which some of you may know, and there are services like Autovelib here in Paris and so on around the world, but they're thinking about selling cars not by selling cars, by selling them by the ride, which is very different thinking from the way car companies have thought. And BMW, in the same way, has a service called Drive Now, also selling vehicles by the minute, and they again have said they may think about not selling cars. Now, BMW for 100 years has been selling performance driving pleasure. Their slogan here, well, that's a new slogan I suggest for them, but their slogan, Freude am Fahren, joy of driving, is going to be a hard thing for them to think differently about, and yet they must. Now, there's another German company that is actually going to have a problem convincing people, trust your lives to our software. Why would we lie? And that's actually very sad, because in the corner I show one of their Audi vehicles, which actually did a lot of impressive research, and that company and the whole industry has been distracted by what happened there with the diesel emissions. Now, when Volvo talked about 2017 and other people named that date, there's a gentleman named Elon Musk. Do you know of him? He has to be first in everything in Silicon Valley, and he does it. So last year, the Tesla car received a software update, and people woke up and found their car, they could take their hands off the wheel on the highway. It's not a full self-driving car. It's an autopilot for the highway, but it's out there and just arrived one morning, which is quite an interesting achievement. Now, one company that was pretty much in last place until recently was Fiat Chrysler. And just a few weeks ago, it was announced that Google will build its fourth generation vehicle based on this Chrysler minivan. Now, that's not a big partnership between the companies, but it's a start for a company that seemed to be doing nothing. And then among French companies, as you know, Renault and Nissan have a partnership where they're run by the same management team. And they have had a lab in Silicon Valley now for several years, close to 5 years, doing development on this. Now, on the other hand, I must say that it is mostly in the Nissan division that the research has been going on. What Renault is offering right now is still a little bit of a step behind some of the others. And Peugeot Citroën has also been making some efforts. This is a demonstration car that they drove from Paris to Bordeaux. Why would you do that? I don't know, but nonetheless, they had the car drive itself there for a conference in Bordeaux. This car drove itself most of the time, and there have been several demonstrations of this driving about 99% of the time, but it's important to understand that 99% of the time does not mean you have 1% left to do. You need to get to 99.99999, and that's 10,000 times harder, not 1% harder. Now, it doesn't take 10,000 times as long, but it is nonetheless a big challenge left to do. Toyota has had several projects going, and they just announced in January $1 billion American research fund for AI in transportation. So we're going to see what comes out of that. The Koreans only entered the game last year, but they've committed a great deal of money to it. The Chinese have also just entered the game. Also, all the suppliers have also been trying to make technology for this. Companies like Valeo, which is in the left-hand corner, Bosch, which is one of the leading companies there. Delphi took one of their vehicles across the United States from California to New York. Now, here is a very interesting demonstration of one of the pioneering vehicles, which is French. This is a company called Navia, and this vehicle is not a concept or a prototype. This is a vehicle that has been for sale now for 2 years. It is currently running a shuttle around a French nuclear facility in the southeast of France. And it is also here being demonstrated, mixed in with other cars, pedestrians, and so on. Now, it does this by not being very fast, not going on the big public streets, but nonetheless, if you want to know what country has actually been the first to deploy this technology commercially, you are in it. Now, of course, the British have something a little sillier looking. But to give them credit, these vehicles are now running around Milton Keynes, a suburb of London, and the United Kingdom actually changed the laws in Britain to allow this, and so 4 pilots will be going on in the United Kingdom in this coming year, one starting. They're already signing up for rides for a project that's going on in Greenwich. Now, this company is also building a car, but they don't say anything about it. They are very secretive about how they work. So we just have some rumors, we just have some leaks that say something in 2019, an electric car with some self-driving ability. Most car companies are predicting more like 2020 to 2021. I have learned one secret thing about the Apple car. It will only work if you have an iPhone. So. People are doing trucks too. These are friends of mine who used to work at Google, and they are now automating long-haul trucks to change the economics of that. And they're not the only ones. I believe I don't have the slide of it, sorry, but Daimler, through their Freightliner unit, has also done that. Now, after all of this, I'll tell you that the leader is still Google. Now, I worked on this team, so I have some bias, but their numbers are immense. They have now had this car drive on ordinary streets for 2.6 million kilometers. That's more than everybody else put together, and times a bit. So it's a very significant lead. And they've been doing it on real city streets, not just on the highway. Most people are focusing on what they can make happen on the highway. This is a video we actually made of the first non-Google employee to get a chance to use the vehicle to run errands.
Here we go. Away we go. Look, Ma, no hands. No hands anywhere. No hands, no feet. No hands, no feet. No nothing. We're here at the stop sign. Yep. The car's using radars and laser to check and make sure there's nothing coming either way. I find myself looking. Old habits die hard, man. They don't die. Right, well, let's go get a taco at the drive-thru. And we're turning into the parking lot. How neat. There we go. Now we kind of creep along here. Does anybody have any money? I've got money. No, I've got my wallet right here. 95% of my vision is gone. I'm well past legally blind.
Well, I'll interrupt the sound for a bit and mention, of course, as you saw, that gentleman has no sight. He represents millions of people who do not have the freedom to get around, the mobility that we all take for granted, but who will regain it with this technology. And I mean all of you as you get older. All right? Because you're going to lose some of those capabilities, but you're not going to lose mobility because this is going to be around. Now, since then, I want to show you Google's third generation vehicle. Okay, now this video accidentally got advanced into the middle of it. I'm going to ask the AV team, can you move the mouse into the middle of the video and reset it to the beginning, please? Sorry about this little technical problem. It turns out that AI is easy. Hello?
Finding out how their day was and not having to wait till you get home and have dinner. And
Ave.
so it'll be good.
Human feeling of it is very well engineered and it is very smooth. There's nothing that makes you feel the least bit threatened. It's impressive. I'm totally
no, all right, sorry.
in love with this whole concept.
This is something that happened. The video was in the middle. I'm gonna have him move his mouse onto the middle of the video. It's magical. Maybe not. No. That's not how we do it.
There it is.
Ah, okay.
Isn't that cute?
So much.
Okay, Eddie, here we go. Yeah. All right, Tommy, let's go. There's no steering wheel in the way.
So if I had a self-driving car, I could spend more time hanging out with my kids or helping them with their homework, even just tending to them, finding out how their day was and not having to wait till you get home and have dinner and all that. So it'll be good.
Human feeling of it is very well engineered and it is very smooth. There's nothing that makes you feel the least bit threatened. It's impressive.
Now, sorry for that little skip. We have a saying in the field that it's AI is easy and AV turns out to be hard. But as you saw in that vehicle, no steering wheel, no pedals, no dashboard even in that vehicle. And it's not threatening to the last gentleman to speak, but trust me, in spite of how cute and silly it looks, it is very threatening to the existing automobile industry. Now, another threat comes from this company here, Uber. Now, Uber has had a self-driving car lab going on now for a little over a year in Pittsburgh, and this is one of their vehicles. And they are now the world's leading brand in selling rides. Now, before I go on, I should mention that that's how the rest of the world sees them. I know that here in Paris, you see them like this. But in the rest of the world, Uber and other companies have built a brand in selling rides, and I'm going to tell you that the future of the auto industry is largely going to move to being about selling rides and not about selling cars, and this makes a big difference. So the other company, Lyft, just received a $500 million investment from General Motors, and General Motors also spent $1 billion to buy a small company you never heard of in San Francisco called Cruise to help them make this technology. I helped Cruise get started and didn't take any equity, damn it. But it's amazing the numbers already being thrown around about this. So, the numbers are huge. $5 trillion in car transportation around the world, millions of lives going on, billions of tons of CO2, all able to be changed by computers and sensors. Let's look, in fact, at the hardware. On top of this vehicle, you saw this spinning sensor. It's the older one. What this is called is a LiDAR. A LiDAR is a light radar. It is able to send out pulses of invisible light and see the world in true 3D. Not the fake 3D you have from 2 eyes, but a real 3D, all directions, all the time. Here's a little view of how it sees. And you can actually see these laser scan lines, and these clouds of dots are low resolution, but clearly you can see their cars and trees and curbs and the lines on the road, all visible with that 99.99999% accuracy that we need in order to make this happen safely. Now you combine that with things like radar, which is another superhuman vision. It sees how fast things are, sees through fog, sees how much further than the LiDAR can see. And my favorite feature of this vehicle, by the way, are these wing mirrors. And that's because, even though there's no one driving, the law requires all cars have to have wing mirrors. So, let's step into the future, and Uber, at least in San Francisco, if not in Paris, has already taught us a lot about what this future might look like. You pick up your mobile phone, you say you want to go somewhere, and a vehicle comes quickly to take you there. If you're alone working, it might have a screen and a desk. If you're with people, it might have chairs that face each other or a couch for a social experience. It does it on the roads that we already have, and this is an interesting lesson of the internet. The internet was built on an idea we call the stupid network, which is to say that the internet itself is very simple. And all the intelligence that made the internet do everything it's done for us is in the edges, in the phones and the web servers, not in the network. Well, this is an interesting lesson for cities. Stupid roads and smart cars. The innovation taking place in the cars, not in the cities. Now, there's a parallel session going on right now, and I'm dissing it because I believe the answer is not to try and make the city too smart, but to make the things that move around the city smart. That's how you get the pace of innovation that the computer industry is famous for. So a vehicle that can do this can do 4 things for you. It can drive you around and do it more safely. That's our first goal. But it also can deliver cars. Cars become this deliverable, fungible object which we can move around on demand. You get cars that can refuel or recharge themselves, and you get cars that can store or park themselves. Now, those last 3 are not as important as keeping you safer, but they have big consequences for cities and for many industries. Let's look at the energy industry in particular. So today, the car industry is driven, I believe, by one key question that's in your mind when you go to a car dealer. You ask, what car do I need for my life? What's the car that meets all of my needs? Do I ski 3 times a year? Well, then I'd better buy one of these. Except then most of the time I just go and buy milk in it, right? But the reality is these outsell sedans in the United States, and they do pretty well even in Europe. What happens when we stop trying to buy a car that meets all of our needs for the next 5 years, a fancy brand and everything else and 5 seats, even if it's not an SUV, and we change the question to what car do I need today? What car do I need for this trip? Well, that has a very different answer. If you're just going across town, and most of the time that is what you're doing, going across town alone. That is 80% of the trips that people take in cars. Well, then a small, lightweight vehicle, the kind that only a few people will buy today, suddenly becomes an excellent choice for everybody. And if you are with 4 friends and you are going to the Alps, well, then send the SUV, because it's a good choice for that trip. This would make our transportation vastly more efficient. If the United States, for example, were to shift itself to electric cars, well, I'll tell you about the consequence of that. But I will tell you that small, lightweight electric vehicles are so efficient that they are not just more efficient than the cars we're driving today. They are more efficient than the transit. And no, not just the sucky American transit, and not just the slightly better French transit, but more efficient than Japanese trains. That's how efficient it can be when you size vehicles to the purpose of the trip you're going, with no empty seats, as trains unfortunately often have. You also change what energy we use for transportation, because robots don't care about the convenience of refueling or recharging. The fact that an electric car takes hours to recharge is no worry to a robot. You don't care, in fact, about the powertrain under the hood in the taxi that's taking you somewhere, do you? Only the spreadsheet of the fleet manager cares about that, and that's a very rational and efficient thing. And that would have big consequences too. This elimination of the 100-year head start that is seen by gasoline, where it's everywhere, on every corner, and beats out the other fuels, that is erased. The disadvantages of the other fuels, be they electricity or biofuel or hydrogen or whatever your favorite one is, those disadvantages are erased when you stop worrying about the energy, and the fleet manager does. The United States, if it switched its urban trips to electric vehicles, would reduce its CO2 emissions by 200 million tons and would no longer need to import oil. So I don't know if you've noticed this about the Americans. They have this really annoying habit of going to war over the oil that they import. Wouldn't it be fun if software could break them of that nasty habit? It's possible. Now, governments, though, aside from going to war over their oil, are actually not doing what we would have expected. In fact, they are jumping up and saying, me, me, me. Please do this here. This is a Nevada license plate, the first one for a self-driving car. But we have seen government-sponsored projects and changes of the law. I told you about the United Kingdom. There are projects in Singapore, in China, in Japan, in many countries around the world. The governments have actually figured out something you wouldn't expect them to figure out. That big disruption may be coming. That the center of the automotive industry may move from places like Detroit or Stuttgart. It may move somewhere else. And if they can make it move where they are, they have done their job. So they are working to make it happen, and people are lobbying for it too. People with children don't want to be taxis anymore. Drunks want to get completely wasted and get home safely, so that's nice. I already told you about the disabled and the people getting old. And I'll mention that, being of Jewish ancestry, there's nothing my Jewish friends are going to enjoy more than arguing about whether it's legal to ride in this car on a Saturday or not. So, see a few people recognizing that argument in the room. Now, nothing is perfect, right? We may see some downsides here. People might not walk very much anymore if we're not careful, and we've seen where that movie goes. We don't want to see that. But there is an answer to that, oddly, which is this very popular European form of transportation. So it turns out that today, when you drive your car somewhere, you have to finish the trip in that car. You can't just leave the car in a random place and ride a bicycle home very easily. But in the future world, you'll be able to ride a car halfway to work and then get on a bicycle and finish the trip, and then take a train the next leg and walk the next leg and have another car take you the next leg. You'll be able to mix and match how you get around in a much more flexible way, and I think that's actually good news for things like walking and riding the bicycle. You can mix them up as you like. Nonetheless, I should point out that these vehicles will have accidents, and eventually accidents that hurt people. That hasn't happened yet. And because perfection is not achievable, it's the wrong goal here. But we have a quirk as humans that people don't like being killed by robots. We're just funny that way. We'd rather be killed by drunk people, because that's what's happening now. We're used to being hurt by other people. And we shouldn't be used to it, but we are. And we're very afraid of being hurt by machines. And we understand why we're afraid of being hurt by machines, but we could find ourselves in political debates between a smaller number of people being hurt by machines and a larger number being hurt by other people and making the wrong decision. Some countries may indeed do that. So, one lesson I hope you take away from this, if nothing else, is that the car is going to change so much that the most important part of the car, where the value comes from in a car, is going to not be the engine anymore, not the luxury of the leather seats or the cup holders. It's going to be the computer and the software. And that computer follows the rules that we call Moore's Law, the rules of the computer world, which has seen everything the computer industry makes double in price performance every couple of years for more than 50 years. Some would even say for more than 100 years. And even in the computer industry, we have trouble getting used to that. We actually, make mistakes not predicting our own rule. Well, the industrial world is going to get a big shock when cars are taken over by computers and they start running on that law, getting better all the time, and it's built by the competing innovators and the styles of the computer industry and the high-tech industries instead of the styles of the industrial world. On the right is an ad for an electric car from about 100 years ago. That's how fast the industrial world makes innovation. We're starting to finally buy some electric cars. On the left is the iPhone, introduced to the world for the first time about 8.5 years ago. Anybody in this room not have a smartphone of some kind with them? And will admit it? Even a few years ago, all of you would have said you have them. That's how quickly computer technologies take over the world. So let's talk about other changes to our cities. Now, a vehicle like this, if it's a taxi, just drops you off and picks up somebody else. But if it's still your car that stays only with you, it doesn't have to store itself where it dropped you off. It can go and park itself valet style, small distance away at a low price. So what we're going to see over time, as these vehicles become more popular, is the parking lots will start emptying out. And the people who own them will say, I've got to do something else with this land. We're going to get a bonanza of land. We're going to turn the car parks on nice occasions into parks. In reality, it's going to be condominiums. I've come to accept that. But this is not the only big change we're going to see in real estate, although it's going to be quite a lot in the suburban parts of our cities, which have parking lots taking up immense amounts of land. Because in real estate, the value of the real estate is derived. They have a joke in the industry. They say it's all from three things: location, location, and location. The meaning of location, the meaning of distance is going to change. This new technology will change it as the car did before. The car re-architected the city of the 20th century, created the suburb, created so many of the forms, the urban forms we have today. You may or may not like those urban forms, but they are the result of the change in transportation we saw in the previous century. And by the way, it happened again in the 19th century when the tram came in and replaced the horse in many cities, creating new forms, new values of real estate. Well, this revolution is going to happen again. We are going to see children get the mobility that adults used to get. Not 4-year-olds, but 8-year-olds, 10-year-olds who are mature enough to play a driving video game. They're mature enough to ride in one of these. They'll have mobility, and they actually govern where adults live. Adults move to places almost entirely because they want their children to have the right neighborhood. We're going to be able to see different structures of how neighborhoods work. We're going to see commutes getting both shorter and longer. We can't even predict everything that will happen because of this. Now, I also want to mention one product. It comes not from France, but from Italy. But nonetheless, around the world, it has become so important that we have a giant infrastructure that no matter where you are, no matter when it is, you're guaranteed to be able to get it in 30 minutes. Now, it's possible to build not a self-driving car, but a self-driving box, a suitcase, a delivery robot. And this is actually a much easier problem than making a passenger car, because you cannot kill a pizza, right? So the safety concerns are a little bit less. You still don't want to hit anybody. So I work with the team now, and they're up in the Baltics, and they are building delivery robots which will get you anything in 30 minutes, not just a pizza. Here you can see the prototype of the robot running on the sidewalk, being polite, getting out of the way of any pedestrian that it might encounter. These vehicles will be able, for example, to have a store put 5 pairs of shoes in the vehicle, and you could get them to your house in a short time, try them on, put 4 pairs back, and have the robot go and take them back. You might decide that you don't even need to own things if you can get them in 30 minutes. Earlier on today, Andy McAfee talked about the peak stuff. he called it, or it had been called by someone else, peak stuff, the idea that maybe we don't need to own so much and we're finding a way to get by with a lot of virtual products, but this may even extend to the physical world. We may be able to move goods almost as quickly as we move data. I've come up with a name for this. I'm sure it's going to catch on. I call it the Internet of Things. Maybe someone took that name very annoyingly. So, here is a list of a dozen industries that I think will see big change because of this technology. Now, the automotive industry we've talked about a lot here, and it is, of course, going to see this big change. And I talked about the energy industry and the oil industry in particular. And that's particularly true in a country like France, which has worked hard to get electrical generation from sources that don't emit CO2, like nuclear. And I talked about real estate, but there are some here you may not have thought about at first. For example, the insurance industry is quite realistically of great concern, because the number of car accidents is going to go down. That's going to reduce the claims. That's going to eventually reduce the premiums. And so their industry will shrink to being maybe a quarter of the size that it is today, at least in the automotive industry. If cars are bought and sold in fleets, they will not be financed by retail auto loans. So if you have a big auto loan business in your bank, you may find that that is going to see a major change. Retailers will see change not just because of the delivery robots that I just showed you, but also by the change in how readily people can get to the retailers if they do want to visit them. And all sorts of retailers will still exist, as well as delivery. Now, doctors are not going to be patching you up from a car accident anymore. A statistic I had on the screen but didn't read to you in the United States shows 3.9 million visits every year to emergency rooms because of car crashes. And so these will go away. Oh, we got a nice little, don't know what that means, but anyway. Now, public transit. Public transit is actually going to see big changes as well. In many cases, it will be eliminated because when we're not at rush hour times, people will find that the availability of very low-cost door-to-door transportation is very heavy competition for public transit. My forecast is that today, taxis in the United States cost about $2.50 per mile to put them in American units, or that's about €1.50 per kilometer. And UberX costs less in most places, not here in Paris so much, but UberX costs about 30% less than that in most places. But car ownership costs only about, in the United States, it costs only about 40 cents per kilometer over the life of owning a car. People are going to be able to sell you rides at that price and even less. Rides in small, lightweight vehicles, which are much cheaper to make, will get down to a price of 20 cents a kilometer or less, which is less for many trips than a bus ticket. Right? So we're going to see car ownership become accessible to entirely new levels of income. Billions of more people around the world will get access to not car ownership, but the ability to use a car, which will change that. But at the same time, I believe we'll be able to move public transit from the way it is now, which is with big vehicles, because we have to have drivers, which follow fixed routes on fixed schedules, to a world where public transit is a computer noticing that there are 15 people over there, and they want to get over there, and sending a vehicle of the exact right size to first gather them together and take them on the common part of their trip, door to door. It becomes possible to move people around our cities with great efficiency and, in fact, with much better activation of the lanes that we have. We don't actually need more infrastructure to move more people because of that. Now, radio and media surprises a lot of people because the first thing to think about radio is that radio primarily exists today for drive time. And if you're not driving, there's no drive time. You don't have to keep your eyes on the road. Instead, the 1.1 hours a day that car owners spend in their cars, and that's a disturbingly high number, but it is true, that becomes for something else. It may be for work, it may be for socializing. A lot of it will be for media, watching videos and sending messages to all your Facebook friends. So the list goes on and on. I'm astounded by the numbers behind this. It's why I got into the field, and I started comparing it to the grandeur of the moonshot, the Apollo program. And in the Apollo program, well, I'm going to butcher the words of the American President John F. Kennedy and say this: this nation should set itself the goal before this decade is out of a computer driving a man to lunch at noon and returning him safely to work. Okay. It may not be a good idea to get a Canadian to do an impression of Kennedy to a French audience. I understand that. But that line reminds me of something else from those speeches, which I like a lot. Kennedy said, some things are worth doing not just because they're easy, but because they're hard. And here we have one of those projects. It is hard. Many people thought it was impossible not that many years ago before they started seeing everybody who didn't know it was impossible getting to work on it. But the great teams are working hard on it. They are making great progress. They are going to succeed, and they are going to change our world. Thank you very much.